So for those of you who don't know us, we are a design research lab at Parsons dedicated to placing people's health at the center of every design decision. We raise awareness about toxics in building products, and we create resources for designers and architects to make healthier places for all people to live. Our big, audacious goal is to make all affordable housing healthier. So one of the ways that we spread this word and raise this awareness is through doing events like this, and we hold them at noon so that we can reach a wide audience across the United States and on the Western continents as well. So to join us for this spring keynote, I'm very, very pleased. We are joined by one of the foremost researchers and thinkers about how our surrounding environments really impact human health. But before we get started there, I just want to give you a little bit of housekeeping. There's a Q&A in the bottom of the screen, and that's open. So while our guest is speaking, just feel free to jot your questions down in that question box. Or if you see a question that someone else has asked that you like, give it a thumbs up, and it'll push it to the top of the queue. So just please use the Q&A instead of the chat box, because the questions that are in the chat box won't be added to the queue. So that's our little housekeeping piece. So to get started, I am honored and delighted to introduce Dr. Shanna Swan, who I've had the great pleasure of getting to know over the last couple of weeks, actually. And feel, hopefully it'll be years. And to give you a little bit of background, for some of you, she needs no introduction, but for others, I'll give you a little bit of background. Dr. Shanna Swan is an environmental and reproductive epidemiologist. She's also a professor of environmental medicine and public health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai here in New York City. Since 1998, Dr. Swan has been conducting studies with a multi-center pregnancy cohort that includes more than 1,500 mothers and their children followed from birth, so that she could better understand how prenatal and early childhood exposure to environmental chemicals impact reproductive health and development. And I think we'll hear a lot about that today. In 2017, Dr. Swan and colleagues published a worldwide renowned paper called Temporal Trends in Sperm Count, a systematic review and meta-regression analysis, which led her to write the book that we're all here to hear about, and many of us have been reading, called Countdown: How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, Altering Male and Female Reproductive Health, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. This was published just last year in 2021 by Scribner, and it's been already translated into 9 languages. And so we know that Dr. Swan is been traveling and been invited to many places, and we're just so honored that she's agreed to come and speak with all of us today. We know that her goal is to widely disseminate this urgent message, and we really believe that designers and architects have a role to play in reducing the impact that some of these chemicals can have on human health and reproductive health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Swan to this proverbial stage. We're so happy to have you here, Shanna. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Josara, for that lovely introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and to meet with you and your audience and friends and colleagues. So let me start my PowerPoint. Put it on slideshow view. This talk is going to not focus particularly on building materials, although I will point out places where that is relevant to the discussion, but actually everything that I say is going to be relevant, and we can talk in the Q&A about how to make the translation, if you will, from the general to your specific it's, your specific case. So here's the roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start with the problem, describe the problem. Then I'm going to go on to these other steps, causes, consequences, and its solutions. So let me say first that, yes, Houston, we have a problem. We demonstrated that in studies for the last 20 years, I and my colleagues, and summarized many of those in our book, Countdown. But the situation is really serious. It's hard to grab attention for it in the midst of so many other serious problems that we're facing. But one of the things I hope you will come away with is recognizing that this is a problem perhaps as serious as many of the other major ones we're facing today. So let me talk a little bit about sperm count. That sounds pretty technical, but that's actually how I got into this.
Shanna, may I just interrupt it for a moment? Should we be seeing slides yet?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we're not yet seeing your slides.
I'm so glad you interrupted me. That's really weird. Okay, so let me go. Oh my gosh, so sorry. All this time I thought I was. Okay, slideshow. Okay, so let me just fast forward then to the problem. And now you can see, right?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so this is how I got involved in this problem. In 1992, there was a paper that came out and it claimed that there was a genuine decline in sperm quality, semen quality over the past 50 years. A huge claim. It was criticized roundly and it had many skeptics, and I was one of them. At first, I was skeptical about this paper and this decline. And so, because I had the opportunity, I took 6 months to go into all of the underlying studies and try to see whether things like how the sperm was counted and who the men were and what were their ages and how obese were they and so on and so on and so forth. All these factors that might contribute to the decline, were they going on here and do they explain the decline? And what I found was no. After all of that work, when I reran the analysis, nothing had changed, not to the first decimal place. So this really convinced me that something was going on. And I spent the next 20 years trying to figure it out, and I'm still working on that question. So here is a comparison of some of the studies that I've done and others have done. The original was not mine, but then I published a paper in 2000 that showed a very similar decline, but we looked at geographic area. And then in 2017 was the meta-analysis, which John Serra talked about, and which is the sort of the starting point for Countdown, the book. I'd like to just focus on unselected Western men. Unselected because fertile men are special. They are fertile, and so they've been selected in some way. Unselected men are representative. And you see that unselected Western men have the strongest decline. The Western versus other is a little complicated because other just don't have very many studies. That's increasing, and there'll be more on that to come, but not today. So I'm having trouble going to the next slide for some reason. There we are. So I wanted to point out that here is a comparison of Western and African countries, and just to say this is not a problem that's limited to so-called Western countries. And it's not just a problem for men. So we spent a lot of time and a whole host of researchers working on these problems to identify reproductive problems in both men and women. And let me just sort of talk briefly about these. Men, of course, I talked about low sperm count, but they also have a smaller genital area, which I'll be returning to, known as the anogenital distance. Smaller penis and scrotum is part of that. And surprisingly, perhaps they have reduced testosterone, resulting in lots of unhappy men for various reasons you can imagine, and genital birth defects. Females, on the other hand, are having children of low birth weight and premature children. They have menstrual problems, endometriosis, and early egg depletion, which is a really big problem, early puberty, increased miscarriage, and then in common, infertility, ambiguous genitalia, hormone abnormalities, and so on. So this is not a male-only problem. It's also not a female-only problem, which is the way reproduction has been viewed in the past. So I'd now like to talk about the causes of these problems. Big topic. Let's just look at what causes could be, possible causes, okay? On the left, possible causes. Well, if you break them down into the, genetics and environment, that's the first split, if you will. I maintain that this cannot be genetic. This is not due to evolution. This is too fast. This is the decline we're talking about has occurred in 2 generations. And by the way, I should mention that those declines in sperm count and all of those other endpoints are occurring at about the same rate, about 1% per year. That doesn't sound like much, right? But that means that in 50 years, which is the scope that we can actually study reasonably, that's halving, cutting in half all of these factors, or doubling miscarriage, premature ovarian failure, testicular dysfunction, and so on and so forth. So that's the drumbeat that we're looking at here. Okay, not genetic, then it's environment. Environment, you can broadly split into chemical and lifestyle. And I'm going to talk about that a little more, and then I'm going to talk about these other breakdowns of chemical exposures. Let's go to lifestyle. So lifestyle factors have been widely studied, perhaps more than chemical almost. And here are some examples of lifestyle factors that can impair reproductive function, fertility, sperm count. Diet is a big one. Western diets do better than, worse than Mediterranean diets. So you want to cut out those French fries and those burgers. Binge drinking also plays a role. Stress is a big one and a hidden one, and difficult, of course, particularly now to control. Heat actually affects more males than females. Obesity affects both. And couch potato behavior, lack of exercise, is also a risk factor. So these are some lifestyle factors. I'm not going to dwell on these because that's not what this talk is about. I just want to recognize them and go on. So now let's go to chemicals. And while there are many, many chemicals in the environment, my work, and I think the relevant work here, focuses on the chemicals that have the ability to affect the body's hormones. And those have been called endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs. Also, I refer to them as hormone hackers because they come in and hack your hormone system. Let's look more at those. So the hormones, the endocrine system is very complex. Here are some of the glands that produce hormones. And what can happen when they're disrupted is many, many things, but here's just one example of what can happen. You can have a receptor on a cell which is ready to accept a hormone receptor, and one of these chemicals, these EDCs, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, comes in and sits in that receptor so that the hormone itself cannot dock in that receptor, and you have disruption of the system that's waiting for that hormonal response to trigger and send information around the body about reproduction, about thyroid function, about many, many other things. There are close to 100 hormones in the body, so there's many, many ways this can happen. And the chemicals that I'm talking about and focusing on are those that can disrupt the hormone signaling or interfere with the production of hormones, the transport of hormones, and so on. Many actions. Here are some of those chemicals. In illustration, So there are the barrier chemicals such as Teflon lining, also found in water-resistant coatings, linings of pizza boxes. There are the phthalates, which make plastic soft and flexible, like these rubber duckies. There are flame retardants. There are pesticides. There are bisphenols, which line tin cans and also paper and have many, many uses. And phthalates are also found in personal care products. This just is a quick overview of the kind of products you might be finding these in. None of these actually specifically refer to your building materials, but I'll give you an example of the use in a building setting in a minute. Here we go. This is a NICU, and in the NICU, neonatal intensive care unit, there is a raft of these chemicals. This is particularly dangerous because the infants shown here are essentially in the womb. They have not matured. Their systems have not matured to a level that they can handle these chemicals, and they're particularly affected, as they would be in the womb. And I will be showing you why that's the most sensitive period. And here are some examples. There are bisphenols that make plastic hard. There are pesticides, which are the result of spraying insecticides, and also some foods that are cooked in that hospital coming through the HVAC. There are PVCs that many plasticizers in this NICU, all of the IV tubing, all of the tubing that feeds the infants. And these have been measured in the infant's urine, and they're extremely pervasive, and they've been shown to have adverse effects. So I want to hone in now even deeper and go into one hormone, and that's testosterone. And that's where I've spent a lot of time. And the reason is it's extremely important for male reproductive development. Remember, I got into this through sperm decline. So here's testosterone. It's playing a role here, a serious role. So let me just dive in to examining what's happening schematically in the development of the reproductive organs, the sex organs. So originally they're undifferentiated. They're the same in men and women, which is kind of a surprise to people. Then testosterone comes along. It's actually produced by the fetal testes if it's not interrupted. And then it is responsible for the production of the male organs and the differentiation of the male reproductive tract from the female reproductive tract. This is extremely critical, and it's underlying a lot of the problems that we're seeing in male reproduction. So what can interfere with testosterone levels? Well, phthalates are really prime candidates. 3 phthalates in particular that are extremely potent, and those are found in personal care products. They're found in everyday plastics. They're also found in the production of food. Here they are in a milking machine, and they're also found in that NICU, and the baby's being fed food, and they're also found in lots and lots of products in the home, such as tiles and wall coverings. Anything with PVC in it is going to have these phthalates in it, and is going to have the potential to interfere with testosterone production and testosterone levels actually in adults. So here's an experiment showing what phthalates can do if the unborn is exposed at the right time. This is an animal study, but I show it because this is so dramatic and because the timing is so exact for an animal. You can actually dose the animal. Start the dosing, end the dosing, and see what's the most effective period, the most sensitive period. So on the left, you see there's an unexposed mom, and her male will be experiencing this rise in testosterone at a very critical period. It's about days 18 to 21. Very short, it's longer in humans, but still not the entire pregnancy. It's early pregnancy. And I'll show you that in a minute. And here's a mom who's been exposed to diethylhexyl phthalate, a phthalate that has the ability to lower testosterone. And what do you see? No peak, no increase. that means that this male is not getting that testosterone surge that he needs to differentiate from the female. This is absolutely critical. And it turns out that when the mother is exposed to DHP, she is producing a male that has a range of outcomes which have been classified as the phthalate syndrome. This is important because there's no other chemical that I know of that has a syndrome named after it. That's how important it is. And so this syndrome is complex, but 4 of the things that make it up are a smaller penis, possibly a malformed penis, undescended testicles, and then a shortening of this distance, which is basically the size of the perineum, the size of the total package, if you will, that contains these organs. Anogenital distance, also called taint and gooch and grundle on the street. You probably heard about it. Probably haven't heard about anogenital distance, but it's been studied for a long time in animals, used in toxicology studies because it's been recognized that it's a marker for reproductive function. And when it's shortened, which is what phthalates can do, there's a lot that can go wrong. Now, I should point out that the animal studies the animals have a short half-life and a short life. And so they were able to see what prenatal exposure does to their adult function. But that's not true for humans yet. The first studies that have been done on the phthalate syndrome in humans were those that we did. And so those children are now just turning 20-something. And we're hoping to be able to study and see what the lifetime consequences are of a short anogenital distance. In a male rat, it's known that this is a reflection of early androgen exposure in utero. That's been known since 1912, actually. And it's also been known that the female AGD is about half that of the male, 50 to 100% longer in males. And as I say, it's been used for a long time. But what about the female, right? And what about the human? So I can tell you later about female effects if you ask. Maybe I won't have time right now, but there are effects on that are relevant for the female. But as far as humans go, I want to point out 2 things here. First of all, the dose that this fetus is getting is extremely small, much smaller than most people would think would be, could have an effect. And that's true for many of these chemicals. And what happens when the mother is exposed herself, the fetus is exposed. There is no placental barrier. This goes directly into the fetus developing system, and has the effects that I've been talking about. So we asked, okay, what about humans? Would we see these same changes in humans if we could look at the mother's phthalate levels? Now, how do you look at phthalate levels? Well, phthalates are water soluble. That means that they get in the urine. That means if you can get the mother's urine when she's pregnant at the right time, then you can look at those measured levels. Then you can get her infants, you can make these measurements, and then you can see whether the mother's urinary levels, they're called metabolites, phthalate metabolites, are related to the development of the offspring, right? That's the program that we've been following for quite a long time now, about 15 plus years. And the answer is yes. Yes, yes. Phthalate causes the phthalate syndrome in human males. Now, I use that word cause very advisedly. I'm a very cautious epidemiologist. I hardly ever use it. But in this case, we have in vitro studies showing the androgen, anti-androgenic action of these chemicals. We have the rodent studies, and we have here too, and there have been more studies showing the same effect of early prenatal exposure to phthalates. So I would say prenatal phthalate exposure causes the phthalate syndrome. Here's something else they do. If you bring a man into the clinic when he's an adult and you measure his sperm count and you measure his AGD, it's asking a lot of these men, but you pay them something and they'll do this. And what we see here is that the longer the AGD, right? You see that increasing AGD along the x-axis, the higher the sperm count. This is really important. This says that that exposure that this male was given in utero is playing out over his lifetime with shorter, lower sperm count. And by the way, there's a gap. I admit to this gap. We don't have the follow-up on these babies yet, but we brought in adult men, measured their AGD and their sperm count. And there's a lot of evidence that AGD is permanent. So we think we're looking at a reflection of their prenatal exposure. Now I want to talk about timing. I mentioned that the window for the rats was very short, 3 days. And it turns out that timing is absolutely critical. This entire story, every exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals has a critical window for a specific outcome. And here's what it is for rodent AGD. And here is what we know for humans. It's much more difficult. We can't get perfectly timed exposure in humans because we're exposed all the time to phthalates. We get these in our plasticizers, we get this in our food, we get this in our buildings, and so on and so forth. So we can't exactly know, what it is on a particular day. But we got urine in the first, second, and third trimester. And what we see in our population, that the association here shown in T1, the first trimester, is significant, but it is not in the second and third trimester. This is consistent with the animal studies. So that's good. We like that kind of consistency. The other way that timing is critical is that the changes that are induced in utero by the mother's exposure are going to last a lifetime. They are not fixable. They are not reversible. This is an example of smoking, not phthalates, but it's a really nice, clean example. If the man smokes, here he is on the right, he's smoking, he reduces his sperm count, yes, 20%, yes, on average, but he can fix that by stopping smoking. If the mother smokes when she's pregnant, she's going to reduce her son's sperm count by more than 20, maybe 40%, that's what was found. And if the man smokes around the time of conception, because he's producing sperm all the time, so what he's exposed to around the time of conception really matters as well, he will also affect his son's sperm count. So the lesson here is in utero exposure is more severe and the changes are not reversible. Very critical. So let me talk about some of the consequences of these changes. First of all, it's very surprising to find out, and we've only done that in the last under 10 years, to find out that when a man has a low sperm count, he dies younger. His life expectancy is shorter. And that's true whether or not he has children. It's more severe if he has no children, but it also is true if he has children. So the changes that affect a man's reproductive development affect his health. It's what we call a canary in a coal mine for health overall. So anything that I'm talking about is going to affect not only reproductive function, not only the ability to have children, but your health throughout life. And that's also true of women, by the way. And another consequence, which I don't have time to go into, but I'm sure you're well aware of, is that this is not a problem that's confined to humans. We have lots of evidence of many, many animal species being affected, their reproductive function, their survival being affected by the presence of these chemicals in their body. I'll give you just two examples. The alligator here on the left was photographed by a friend, a colleague, Lou Gillette, and he showed that when this alligator is swimming in the water that's contaminated by pesticide runoff, he's going to have a smaller penis and he's going to produce smaller litters. So he is, definitely has impaired reproductive function. I don't have a picture of a frog here, but my colleague Tyrone Hayes has shown that when frogs are raised in an atrazine-rich environment, the pesticide atrazine, they have reproductive function, including they have the same, they have eggs and sperm in the same animal, testes and ovaries in the same animal. So disorders of sexual development, which is a question for humans as well. This is, not going to be a talk about animals, but I just want you to realize that this is not a problem that's confined to humans. Another way that we have a long reach for these chemicals is that we have exposure over multiple generations. So when the mother ingests a food or breathes in air that's been contaminated, or puts, by the way, chemicals on her skin through hand cream or nail polish, then she will expose her fetus. So she's F0, her fetus is F1, but within that fetus are the reproductive cells that will produce the offspring of that fetus that will be F2. And there's quite a bit of literature now showing that this will extend to later generations. This makes it hard to think about stopping this problem because we are now reflecting damage that was done to our parents and to our grandparents and possibly our great-grandparents. So this is a very long reach problem. So let me just talk a little bit about some solutions. First of all, there's a very beautiful study that was done by Pat Hunt at the University of Washington. And she showed that recovery is possible after an insult to the reproductive system. So what she showed that the highest exposure was in the first generation of her study. So she had a rat, it was a mouse actually, that was directly exposed, and he was the most impaired. Then the son did not get any additional exposure, had only the inherited exposure, if you will. And then his testicular health improved. And finally, in the great-grandson, who was completely unexposed, he was completely functional. So in 3 generations, this can be restored. However, that's a long time for humans. It's pretty short for rats, 6 years. But for humans, it's 75. And I don't know that we have 75 years to see sperm counts and fertility continuing to decline, which they are doing, by the way. So here are some things that we can do and must do, I think. The first one is to stop replacing the chemicals that we found out to be harmful with others that look a little bit different but have the same harms. And a great example of that is BPA. So BPA, which is a chemical that makes plastic hard and is, by the way, very prevalent in the NICU, like in those bassinets and other places, when people got upset about these and demanded BPA-free water bottles and baby bottles, the manufacturers made those. And they made them by substituting BPA for another bisphenol, actually several. 2 of them are BPS and BPF, which turn out to also have many of the same effects as BPA. That happened with phthalates. After our first study came out in 2005, showing the phthalate syndrome was seen in humans, there was a lot of concern, and there was the Consumer Protection Act of 2008 that talked about these phthalates in particular. And so actually the use of the worst offender, which is diethyl hexylphthalate, decreased 50% between the 2 studies that I showed you. Actually decreased 50%. I was thrilled. I was absolutely, wow, did we do this? That's fantastic. But it turned out that they then brought in DINP and DIOP, and a study in Sweden showed the same effects on male AGD for DINP as we had shown for DEHP. And so it's It's very frustrating. You can imagine that these products don't have to be tested before they go into market in the US and other countries, with some exceptions in the EU, fortunately. And so manufacturers can introduce these at will. And the only way that we know if they're harmful is if we study them. These studies take 10 years at a minimum to establish harm and millions of dollars. Our studies cost $10 million. So we can't afford it as a society. We can't afford the time and we can't afford the cost. We have to do this better. This is to illustrate the experiment that we're all part of. And I want to stress this. We are the guinea pigs now for these chemicals unless they are tested before they are put into market. We are guinea pigs without giving our consent. So I'm now going to talk about 3 important steps that have to be taken, which are extremely difficult. And I don't have the answers for how to do it. I have advice on what we should be talking about. So we want to remove the chemicals from commerce, from our products that are hormonally active, that can interfere with the body's hormones in many of the ways I briefly discussed. I haven't said a lot about low doses, except to mention that these are effective at low doses, but we have to remove the chemicals that cause harm at low doses. These are hidden offenders. They're not pharmaceuticals. They're not pesticides necessarily. There are very, very subtle doses that can cause very, very big effects. We need to remove chemicals that are environmentally persistent. I haven't talked about persistence, but there are many forever chemicals that stay in the body for a long time, stay in animals for a long time, stay in the soil, stay in the water, that go on to re-harm us over and over again, across generations even. And we have to remove the chemicals that have not been tested for toxicity. The Consumer Protection Act was a step in the right direction. The original Toxic Acts just grandfathered in tens of thousands of chemicals that had been in use, and they said, well, these don't seem to be doing any harm. Let's just leave them in and assume they're fine. They're good to go. And that's how most chemicals have been treated. People say, well, doesn't the FDA control these? No, FDA is Food, Drug, Agriculture. They don't control or limit these chemicals. So we have to replace those with chemicals that do not have endocrine disrupting effects. Hard to say which those are. Hard to test that, and that's something I'm going to be talking about with John Sarah and her group, because she's doing a great job of trying to encourage including in building materials, chemicals without endocrine disrupting effects. Sometimes hard to test for that. It's hard to be sure they're free of low dose adverse effects, but we have to do that. We have to be sure they're not environmentally persistent, and we have to do this before they're marketed. And then we have to regulate them. And this is a whole other challenge, which we're not meeting very well at all. The EU is doing better. Maybe we can take some, learn from them, but we have a whole world here, and most of the countries in the world have no effective regulation. We have to regulate by looking at these low dose effects. That's not being done. We have to look at mixture effects. Mixtures, we're exposed to, if I looked at your urine, my urine right now, we would measure up to close to 100 chemicals in our bodies. That's hard for people to understand, to believe, but it's been shown over and over again. And that means we're exposed to these simultaneously, and that we're exposed to the effect of the mixture of these chemicals. And as you know from going to the doctor and having her say to you, tell me everything you're taking, because I don't want to give you something that's going to interfere with what you're taking, or have a bad interaction with what you're taking. Well, these chemicals do that. They have a bad interaction. And many of them persist in the environment. And as I've said, there are the risks of these multiple untested chemicals. Very, very few chemicals have been tested. Very few chemicals have been regulated. As I'll just give you one example, personal care products in the US, 7 have been banned. In the EU, 10 have been banned. In the EU, 10,000. So it's, I may have gotten those numbers wrong, but the point is, we're not doing it, and there are better ways to do it, and it's being done better elsewhere. So I just want to end by making a pitch for Countdown. A lot of this information is in Countdown, and in particular, people always ask me, well, what can we do? What are the practical things that we can do? And we have 2 chapters in Countdown about the practical things you can do to limit your exposure in your foods, in your home, in your personal care products, in your daily lives. And for you attending the seminar, I'm hoping you will help me understand how we can remove these things from our built environment, because it's absolutely essential. And I think this work that the group is doing is incredible, and I'm glad to be part of it. Thank you very much.
My goodness. You have all of us stirred up.
Good.
I'm sure you haven't been able to follow in the chat and all these questions, but everyone's stirred up and kind of wowed by your research. Shanna, thank you so much for doing it for the last 20 years, 20 or more years, and for bringing it to everyone's attention in the way that you describe these things, which are obviously epidemiological. You're able to convey this in a way that is really easy to understand. So thank you for that part too, because there's a desperation to translate the research that you're doing in the medical profession, in the science, in the scientific labs, into what we do in practice of design and architecture. So thank you. And I think, if we could all join on, I think you would have a round of applause here. So, making that happen. But we would love to answer some of the questions in the chat. There are many of them, and I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them, but maybe we could start. There are some that are similar. And one that's kind of interesting is about the clothing that we wear, the fibers that that we put on our bodies, and are those harmful? And, I think one of the things that's always interesting to hear about is like, so you're measuring the urine, you're measuring, the fetus, but the fluid, but how do we get exposed?
Right.
How is this getting into us? And is clothing one of those ways that it gets into us?
Great. So how are we exposed? Every which way. Okay, so we're exposed through ingestion. There's 3 ways to be exposed, really: ingestion, inhalation, and dermal, right? Dermally. And we're exposed all 3 ways. So ingestion, that would be our food and our beverages. And inhalation, obviously, is what's in the air. And the dermal is more complicated, and that's where the clothing comes in, although the clothing also comes in with the inhalation, so the off-gassing. So clothing contains many chemicals, and I think the area of concern right now among scientists is the micro plastics and the nanoplastics, which are the very tiniest, smallest size plastics. The macro plastics are much easier to understand, and they've been around for a long time. But the micro and the nano are now really hot, research topics. And they've been shown to be in all the clothing that's made from recycled plastics. And all the materials, all the recycling of plastics ends up with bringing nano and microparticles, plastics, into our bodies through inhalation and dermal absorption. So it's just a terrible cycle, isn't it? I mean, we want to be good, we want to recycle, we want to use this stuff again, and then we get it to come back and bite us. So I don't have the answer to that, but except to say that yes, we're exposed through our clothing. Dermal exposure. I should also mention that one of the reasons that phthalates are used is to increase absorption. They're put into things to increase the absorption. So anything that contains phthalates is going to go into the body even quicker. They're put into pesticides to increase absorption. They're put into skin cream. That's why they're there. Yeah.
Yeah. Ugh. It's really so unnerving. So,
yeah.
But it's great information to know. I mean, I think that's the science behind this is really clear. There's another question about, in the architecture and design world, we're often faced with the plethora of building products that are based in vinyl, in polyvinyl chloride, because they're inexpensive and the manufacturers have done a very good job of making them aesthetically pleasing and cost efficient. And so they're being used in huge amounts of ways. And we had an event last fall which showed just like the astronomical growth in the production of PVC products. So, one of the questions is, and there's a lot of manufacturers who promote their vinyl products that don't have phthalates. So there's a question about, what about phthalate-free vinyls?
That's a great question and not one that I can answer, unfortunately. I know that one of the major uses of phthalates is in PVC, but I don't know what the replacement plasticizer, because PVC has to have a plasticizer, right? To give it its, structural properties. So I don't know what is used as an alternative in PVC. It may well, I doubt that it's a plant-based plastic, because that's much too, that's expensive and it's niche. It's a niche thing, the potato, they're not made from potatoes. I don't think. It's probably made from maybe a pet, PET or some other, but that's a great question and something we could look at together. I don't know.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. There's another question just about the research in general. Like, why did you focus your studies more on men rather than women? And is that because the studies on women are less clear, or what is that reason?
Okay, great question. First, just let me say as an aside that for years and years and years, medical research has been done primarily on men. I don't know if people know that. That just, Ambien, for example, was tested on men, and when women took it, they had different effects at the same dose as men. Okay, so they have to be tested on women, but they haven't been. And the NIH actually put out a proclamation that 5 years ago that from then on, all NIH-funded studies had to include women. But when we had our first study, we wanted to follow up the girls that were born to our pregnant women, and we were not funded to follow the girls, which is absolutely shocking. We did actually get private funding for that, but that was the attitude, that research was done on men because women were too complicated. They had all these hormonal changes and moods and blah, so let's just stick to the men. Okay, so that's one thing. Another reason I studied the men is because my interest, the way I got into this was through sperm. So the third thing is that it's much easier to study men because you can get a semen sample. You cannot get an egg sample without a lot of difficulty. You can't visualize the genitals on a man. You just tell him to take down his pants and you can see what's there, right? But what do you do for a woman? You have to have an ultrasound, right? So it's much, much harder to study women. And we have to do that. We have to do more studies on women, but they're kind of, for all of these reasons, trailing behind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting answer. Goodness. So just following on that, there's a question from Christine that says, should doctors be testing our hormone levels regularly so that we know if we're at risk? And is there a way to adjust the hormone levels in a person?
Two good questions. Testing hormone levels would be, I'm not sure that's going to be routine. I'm not sure it should be routine. I think that the hormone levels in utero are what we really want to know about. that we can't know. Okay, so that's one thing. You can know about a woman's hormones when she's pregnant, her hormones, although you can't know about the fetuses. And by the way, if the woman has excess testosterone, for example, if she's PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, she will have a girl who's masculinized, who has a longer AGD. So I mentioned that, I said this was also a female story. So it would be great to know the woman's hormones when she's pregnant, and they're not routinely measured. But what I really would like to see is have men's sperm count measured regularly. So women go to OB every year. I mean, most do, and get checked and check for this and that. And so that's, we keep track of that, but we don't do that for men. Men have no idea. They have no idea. They just think, when I need it, I'm good to go. And then they're shocked when they're not. So I think that, men getting a sperm count, and possibly if they're thinking about delaying having a child, but wanting one in the future, they might want to bank their sperm. That's just a suggestion that many men are doing now.
Wow. What a crazy thing. So there's a big question. A lot of people have this question, which is, do you know the countries that have the best regulations regarding chemicals that are permitted to be on the market?
There's very good, I would say, nobody's perfect. Right. First of all, there's a lot of work to be done everywhere, particularly in the area of low doses and mixtures and so on. But the EU regulations are definitely ahead of the game, and they have regulations called REACH, which stated that a chemical had to be tested, proven safe before it was entered the market. That's not entirely true, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. Scandinavian countries are very advanced in controlling both exposures and regulating exposures. So yeah. That's great. And I know there's at least one Danish listener on, and thanks to Denmark for their exceptional work in this area.
Yeah, Denmark is really doing a lot of work, in Scandinavia too. Yeah, there's a lot of questions here related to the design industry, which I know isn't your expertise. So for those, there's a lot on the Healthy Materials Lab website that we've collected in our tools and guides and in our material collections, where you can find healthier alternatives, and where you can also find a lot of the material health research that's been done from a bunch of different countries that's available there. And one of our teammates will put those links in the chat here. But one of the questions for you, Shanna, is, and I wonder if, I wonder if this is a question for you, but the question is it's always an uphill battle relating, being able to convey this information to a client, for instance, because a client might be saying, well, we want these plastic floors, or we want to use plastic paints in our project. So the question is what's the best way to convince them so they understand that the risks are real? And, your research is very, and are there resources to share that you would point people towards?
That's such a great question. It really gets to the heart of what I want to do next, which is, convince people this is a problem. There are lots of very good resources. And by the way, again, I'll point to Countdown, because we have several, we have a whole section on that. And just off the top of my head, Environmental Working Group has a lot of great consumer guides, and Made Safe is a great resource, and Silent Spring Institute, and there's many, many, many resources to turn to. However, convincing somebody that this is worth spending money on, right? Because cleaner is more expensive usually, isn't it? So convincing people this is worth spending money on. I honestly don't know what will move people. I'm hoping that, knowing that these chemicals can affect their, maybe they care about having children, but if they don't care about having children, maybe they care about how long they're going to live. Because, there is this link to life expectancy now with low sperm count. So there's been no study that I know of, but there may well be a study linking early exposure per se to lifetime no, there couldn't be because we haven't had the time passing yet. But from, the first studies came in 2000 because that's when you could start measuring things in urine. So those were the first studies really in humans. And so to know the effect on lifespan, you would have to wait probably till 2070. And we don't have that long. We're going to have to be convinced before then by these other things.
It's true. We don't have long, and that's the piece that's, I don't know. That's why I think that's why we're here basically, because we know that we need to start changing the way that we need to be changing the way that we're specifying and what we're specifying. Heidi has a big question that a lot of people also agree with, which is like, what political and legislative leverage points do you think are most feasible at this point? Like, which sectors of our economy need to be leaned on the most? Are they investors, or what do you think? Where should we put pressure?
This is not, unfortunately, this is something I'm learning about now. I think, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know. And there might be people on this chat who could answer this better than me. But our government is so broken in so many ways in terms of regulation that it's hard to know where to start. EPA would be the natural place to start, but I've talked to them, lectured them, I had webinars with them, and this generation now is much more open to that, but they're really crippled in terms of lack of resources and lack of information. So I can't answer that. I would love to, maybe together we can help answer that question.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that we've thought about it is like legislation takes so long and is a very difficult process. And as designers and architects, we can make change right away. We can just say, you know what, we're not going to use those products that have endocrine disruptors in them. We just won't use them. Right. And then we can, if we do that en masse, we can, decrease the demand and put pressure on the manufacturers.
I think decreasing demand and changing consumer interest, what people are interested in, is the way to go, like you said. And just like as people, wanted BPA-free bottles and bought them, I think, if they can learn that having PVC-free, wall coverings and floor coverings, for example, if that's the message we want to give, I don't know, then they'll ask for that, and then they'll pay for that because that's the right thing to do. I think many people do want to do that.
Yeah. Well, we're right at 1 o'clock when we promised to close, and there's still 15 open questions here in the chat. So I never want to close before all the questions are answered, but I think we might just have to do that for now. And I'll just have to thank you, Dr. Swan, for sharing this research. Again, it's so important, and it's really, really important for us to translate your research and make change in the buildings where people all live, and with the things that we all live with. And we can do that as architects and as designers of interiors, of products, of fashion, of all kinds of things. We can do that. Thank you for coming.
And let me thank you for your fantastic work. And I think it's so valuable, and I'm so happy to have met you and be working with you now, and look forward to future collaboration.
Yeah, that's equal. We're in a mutual admiration society.
Okay.
And to our guests, thank you all for coming. We're really so happy that you came to, somebody said it's mind-blowing, and I think that's true. It's great that you stayed to listen to Shanna's research today. We do invite you to come back in a few weeks. We have a couple of extra two-part series, actually, a two-part series, an event series called Mycelium Millennium. And mycelium is one of those materials that's being used and innovated with to be a true healthier substitute to some of these plasticizers. And it's a real regenerative material. So in these events, we'll speak to innovators, design researchers, and manufacturers who are manifesting mycelium and its potential across the fields of design and textiles and architecture. So we really hope you'll come back. The first event is on March 23rd, and the next one is on April 7th. And we're just dropping registration information in the chat now. So that's on the positive side. There is innovation happening to make alternative materials that do not contain these endocrine disrupting chemicals, and that they're coming, and they're coming onto market soon. We heard through the grapevine that there's a huge manufacturing facility being developed for mycelium right now in the Netherlands. So please come back, and so we can share that new research with you as well. And yeah, we're so glad you're all here, and we'll be in touch soon about more of these events. And in the meantime, and we'll be in touch soon with our collaborations with Shanna as they develop. So thanks again, Shanna, for coming.